Last but not least is oxidative phosphorylation. So oxidative phosphorylation is going to be our aerobic energy system. So we require oxygen to utilize it. It's going to use fuel from carbs, fats, and proteins. But just again, be aware that this is not our favorable, mostly in starvation. This has a limited supply, and this is a very unlimited supply of fuel that we can utilize. If you haven't guessed by the picture, athletes who are going to use this system are going to be very aerobic in nature: marathon runners, ultra marathon runners, triathletes, cross country runners, long distance people that bike, swim, etc. So we like to think of the anaerobics or the aerobic system or the oxidative system as like the tortoise and the hare, okay? And so the story is really cool, right? Is that the tortoise feels like slow and steady is going to win the race, where the hare, on the other hand, wants everything to be super fast and quick, and that he's going to beat the tortoise. And so the aerobic energy system takes time to not only get going, but also to get into this like steady state where it is constantly resupplying for hours at a time. So the ATP that can be created from the aerobic based system is going to be dependent on the substrate. So dependent on if it's a carb or a fat or a protein, and it will produce anywhere from 32 to 33 ATP with one glucose molecule and 100 plus ATP from a fatty free acid molecule. And the 100 plus, this goes back to when I said in the when we break the carbon chain on that fatty acid on the fat to create a fatty free acids for us to utilize. It will depend on the type of fat that is utilized, depending on how many ATP we get from that molecule, which is awesome. So the duration here is a steady supply for hours, which is why that marathon runner, right, that ran, he probably used a lot of that glycolytic based system, but he did probably have a very well-trained oxidative system. Most complex of the three biourogenic systems, so compared to the ATP CPR based system and the glycolysis based system, and this is going to occur in the mitochondria. So oxidation of a carbohydrate has three different stages. One, it has glycolysis. Two is the Krebs cycle, and three is what we call the electron transport chain, or ETC. A distance runner with a high aerobic capacity can supply muscles with more fuel compared to just glycolysis alone. So if you are a really long distance based runner, you will probably have a very high VO2 because you're able to supply the muscle with more fuel over time compared to just glycolysis. But it's important that VO2 max isn't everything. So your ability to do that efficiently isn't the end all be all. But oxidation of carbohydrate in the Krebs cycle is going to include a couple of steps. So the first one is that we have one molecule of glucose is going to give us a byproduct of two acetyl-CoA enzymes, okay? So these acetyl-CoA is going to give us one molecule of glucose is going to give us two complete cycles of the Krebs cycle because of these two acetyl-CoA. One glucose molecules will double the amount of ATP yielded in the Krebs cycle because of this two complete cycles that we get. We have two acetyl-CoA that give us two GPT, two DTP, and give us two ATP. But we also have this idea that hydrogens are released into the cell that also need to be utilized. So when we have too many hydrogen ions, we can become very acidic, and it will actually inhibit performance. So we move these hydrogen ions into the electron transport chain to utilize those as forms of ATP as well. Now, you guys, this again, I'm not going to force you guys to memorize which energy system creates X amount of ATP. How many acetyl-CoA are produced from one molecule of glucose? Okay, that this is not that case. I just want you guys to know and learn this information a little bit, or have like a topical point of view of this. So one glucose of ATP is going to, I'm sorry, one glucose molecule is going to give us around 32 ATP, and one glycogen molecule will give us 33 ATP. And it's because they say that we have to borrow an ATP to convert this into the going into the glycolytic based system. So the breakdown of total net ATP, glycolysis is going to give us 2 or 3. The GTP from Krebs cycle is going to give us an extra 2 ATP. The 10 NADH is going to give us 25 ATP. And then the 2 FAD will give us an extra 3 ATP for us to give us the grand total of the amount of net ATP that will be created through one carbohydrate going through the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. That is where we get this 32 number from. So again, you guys can click on this and kind of look at that, but you guys do not need to memorize this at all. So do not stress out about it. Review it, take a look over it. I know it's a lot of material, but the aerobic based system, we just went over how to utilize a glucose molecule inside of the Krebs cycle and electron transport train to create this 32 ATP, which is a lot of energy compared to when we look back to just the glycolysis alone and the PCR-based system. So fat is going to be our biggest bang for our dollar. Triglycerides are our major fuel source that we have, but we need to break those down into glycerol or fatty-free acids to be utilized within these energy systems. And so this occurs through lipolysis, and it's carried out by lipase, which is the enzyme that is going to help break down this triglyceride molecule. The rate of fatty-free acid entering the muscle is going to depend on the concentration gradient of hydrogen ions, and this is going to yield 3 to 4 more times ATP than glucose, which is absolutely incredible. And so the slower than glucose oxidation, but that slow and steady, right, from the tortoise is going to give us that biggest end product that we need to keep sustaining over time. The oxidation of fat is going to also include the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, just like the glucose molecule did. But we have acetyl-CoA that will enter the Krebs cycle, and then from there, it is going through a path of the glucose oxidation. So the different fatty-free acids have different number of carbon bonds that we talked about earlier, and those different carbon bonds will create us a different net of ATP. And so that's why it's really cool when we think about how the body breaks down fat over time and how large the ATP net worth is. So if we just look at how the oxidative Krebs cycle and electron transport chain broke down one glucose molecule and gave us 33 ATP. When we utilize fatty free acids, we can get a net of around 106, which is crazy, or more, or a little bit less. So I think it's important for us to understand that over the long term, so people like ultra marathon runners, anyone who's going to be running any of those crazy races, is that slow and steady may win the race because we're able to get more ATP production out of those energy systems. So negative feedback from oxidative phosphorylation is going to be regulated by the Krebs cycle, and this is done through isocreatine dihydrogenase, and this is going to be our rate limiting enzyme here. So it's very similar to PFK and glycolysis. It is going to regulate the electron transport chain, and it's going to inhibit ATP and activated by ADP. So when we have enough ATP, this enzyme stops coming, right? We slow it down, we inhibit it because we have enough ATP to supply the body with what it needs. When we have a lot of ADP that we need converted into ADP, this enzyme will help speed up the process. That's that idea of that rate limiting enzyme. So our 3 energy systems, you guys, as a big take home message, I want you to think of them as this continuous amount of work that's being done. We don't just go from one to one to one. We go from them all together. They're all kind of working simultaneously, We just may find the fuel sources in one over another. Okay. Each system is always going to be functioning even at rest, and only the relative contribution of each system varies at a given time. So if a bear came into a room and we need to get out of the room quick, we're going to rely on the ATP PC system. If we need to run away from something that's chasing after us and we have 2 minutes to do it in, we're going to rely heavily on the glycolytic system. And if we decide to go run a marathon, we are going to rely heavily on that oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic based system. But in order to get to each one of those systems, right, the other one is still working in the background or helping us get the kickstart going before the other one kicks on. And so I really like this graph because it does highlight the fact that we're all working together. So even when we're using mostly ATP PCR system, we are also gearing up to get this aerobic based system in place, right? To take over when this depletes. And then our glycolytic system or glycolysis is going to also kick into high gear. So it's really interesting when you look at how the body functions to prepare us to help us keep us going when we need to. So there are two variables that will influence each one of these systems being used, and that is intensity and duration. Okay. How long is it? What is the intensity level? And so, exercise metabolism affects the event and duration of the intensity contribution to the aerobic or anaerobic ATP production. So if we are weightlifting or diving or running a 200-meter dash, we are not utilizing any aerobic based system, right? Like hardly any. Is it going on in the background? Sure, absolutely. But we are utilizing a lot of our anaerobic based systems, okay? The same thing here for time, right? Anything that's 1 to 3 seconds to 2 minutes, okay? So this is a really cool way to kind of look at, okay, well now if I'm going to run a 10,000 meter marathon, I'm going to be primarily aerobic, right? Hardly any anaerobic because I'm going to need those long sustaining fuel sources from the Krebs cycle and from the electron transport chain that are going to give me a lot of ATP to keep moving forward. So when we do strength training and sprint training, we are going to have an increase in muscle PCR. So we are going to have delayed fatigue in the early sense of utilizing this system. We're going to have increased muscle glycogen storages, right? Because we're going to train this system to have these storages, to pull them and use them when we need them. We're going to have an increased tolerance to lactic acid based levels, and we'll probably learn to utilize them and shuttle them where we need it to be so that we can go for longer periods of time and have an increase in strength and power. And then muscle coordination to increase the strength and power in general. So we want to become really good at utilizing our glycolytic and our PCR based systems, and we do that through training. But this is the physiology that occurs behind it. So it gets really cool when you think about it in terms of how do I train that physiological system to become the best ATP producing machine to help delay fatigue and increase strength and power. And then on the other hand, we have our endurance-based training. So when we think about training our VO2 max, how much oxygen we can utilize at a maximal capacity, it's going to help increase our times to be faster, and we're going to cover greater distances. We're also going to become machines at removing lactic acid so that we have a delay in fatigue. So when we have a buildup of lactic acid, you guys, we also have a less amount of calcium that can be used in muscle contractions. And so calcium is a mineral that we need in order to contract our muscles properly. So if we have a buildup in lactic acid, we not only have an increase in the acidity in the blood, but we also have an increase or a decreased amount of calcium, and we need the lactic acid to be buffered out of there so the calcium can be utilized to maintain muscle contraction. We also have a increased use of fat fuel. So we want to utilize our fat over the carbohydrates, right? Because we want this big bang of ATP over a period of time. And then we can also increase our muscle glycogen storages, right? We can always have this reservoir of fuel to provide our body with what we need in order to train properly. So I will take any questions that you guys have. Please feel free to reach out. And again, I'm really sorry for our day being ruined. And I hope that this gets up there and it's somewhat helpful for you guys. But I will see everybody in lab on Thursday.